The parchment was heavy, sealed with crimson wax that looked entirely too much like dried blood. It was an invitation from the man who broke her. Alpha Rorik was celebrating the birth of his new heir, demanding his discarded, Barren mate attend to witness his triumph. He wanted to see her shatter. He didn't know she was coming, and he certainly didn't know she was walking through his iron gates with the true Alpha heir holding her hand. The iron axe bit into the frozen pine with a dull, echoing thud. Sigrid didn't stop. She wrenched the blade free and swung again, letting the momentum carry the weight of her shoulders. The wood split with a sharp crack, sending pale splinters flying like shrapnel against her leather apron. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of the deep woods. Sweat cooled on her brow, mixing with the grime of a hard day's labor. It was a quiet life here in the borderlands. Brutal, but quiet. There were no pack politics, no whispers in the corridors, no pitying glances directed at her flat stomach. The crunch of heavy boots on the frost-hardened mud broke her rhythm. Sigrid lowered the axe. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. The scent of roasted meat, fine oils, and arrogant entitlement rolled off the man in waves. A keep wolf. Sigrid, the voice rasped. It belonged to Fenwick, one of Rorik's lesser messengers. He stood at the edge of her modest clearing, looking at her mud-caked boots and calloused hands with thinly veiled disgust. "You're a long way from the stone walls, Fenwick," Sigrid said. Her voice was utterly flat. She wiped a stray strand of dirt-streaked hair from her forehead. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he pulled a thick roll of parchment from his riding cloak. He tossed it. It landed in the dirt at her feet. "From the Alpha King. You are summoned." Sigrid stared at the parchment. She didn't move to pick it up. "I have no Alpha. Rorik made that abundantly clear 5 winters ago when he dragged me to the border and told me to run. It's not an order. It's an invitation," Fenwick sneered, adjusting the reins of his restless mount. "To the pup ceremony. His new mate, Livia, has delivered a strong son. The Alpha wishes for all those tied to his past to witness the future of the pack, to see the joy you failed to provide. The sheer audacity of it hung in the frigid air. It wasn't enough that Rorik had cast her aside. It wasn't enough that he had paraded his new, fertile chosen around the courtyard, while Sigrid packed her meager belongings. Now, he wanted her back in his hall, just to rub her face in the dirt. To prove, finally and publicly, that she was the broken one. Sigrid finally bent down and picked up the parchment. The heavy red wax bore the stamp of the snarling wolf, Rorik's seal. She felt nothing. No heartbreak, no crushing despair. The woman who would have wept at this insult had died in a blizzard 5 years ago, freezing in a snowbank until something primal and furious forced her to get back up. "Tell him I received it," she said quietly. Fenwick smirked, turning his horse. "I'll tell him you're too ashamed to show your face. It's for the best. You'd only sour the mead." He spurred his horse and vanished down the logging trail. Sigrid stood in the silence of the clearing for a long time. The wind howled through the barren branches, biting through her wool tunic. She looked at the invitation, then walked toward the small, smoke-stained cabin at the center of the clearing. She pushed the heavy oak door open. Inside, a fire crackled warmly in the stone hearth. Sitting on the braided rug, wrestling a carved wooden wolf with intense, silent concentration, was a boy. He was 5 years old. He was tall for his age, with broad shoulders that already hinted at a massive frame. But it was his eyes that caught the firelight, pale, piercing, ice blue. The unmistakable eyes of the Alpha line. "Mama." The boy looked up. He dropped the wooden toy. "Torsten," Sigrid breathed, her voice softening in a way it never did for anyone else. Rorik was a fool. He was arrogant, impatient, and utterly blind to the workings of nature. When he banished her for being barren, Sigrid hadn't known she was carrying. The brutal winter famine and the agonizing stress of her failing mating bond had sent her wolf into deep survival mode. Her body had hidden the pregnancy, locking the spark of life deep inside to protect it from the starvation of the packlands. It wasn't until she was months into her exile, safe in a neighboring territory, that her body finally yielded to the truth. She had birthed Torsten alone on a floor of pine needles, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he smelled of wild iron and unyielding authority. He was an alpha, the true firstborn heir. Torsten scrambled up and walked over to her. He didn't run like a human child. He moved with the deliberate, heavy grace of a predator. He looked at the crushed parchment in her hand. "Is it bad news?" "No, little wolf," Sigrid said, crouching down to meet his gaze. She smoothed his dark hair, identical to the man sitting on the throne miles away. "It's an invitation to a feast. Are we going?" Sigrid looked at the red wax. She thought of Rorik's smug face. She thought of Livia, draped in the furs that rightfully belonged to Sigrid. But mostly, she thought of her son, chopping wood in exile while a second-born pup was paraded around as the future king. She crushed the wax in her fist. The seal shattered into a dozen pieces, crumbling onto the floorboards. "Yes," Sigrid said, her eyes darkening. "We are going. It's time you saw where you come from, and it's time they saw you." She spent the evening packing. She didn't own fine silks or jeweled gowns. She packed her heavy riding leathers, her thickest furs, and the rusted iron dagger she kept by her bed. She laid out Torsten's best tunic, woven of sturdy grey wool, simple but impeccably clean. She didn't need to dress him in gold for them to know what he was. The blood would do the talking. The journey took 3 grueling days. The spring thaw had turned the roads into rivers of thick, sucking mud. Cold rain lashed at them for the first 48 hours, soaking through their cloaks and chilling them to the bone. They walked. Sigrid had no horse, and she refused to beg a ride from passing merchants. Torsten trudged beside her, his small boots sinking deep into the muck. He didn't complain once. When the rain was at its worst, he merely pulled his hood lower and matched her stride. The wolf inside him was already burning hot, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, the rain cleared, leaving a bruised purple sky in its wake. Through the tree line, the massive stone spires of the iron hold finally pierced the horizon. It was a brutal, ugly fortress. Black stone mortared with the blood of generations. Banners of crimson and iron grey snapped violently in the wind. As they drew closer, the overwhelming scent of the pack washed over them. Wood smoke, roasting ox, spilled ale, and the sharp tang of hundreds of wolves gathered in one place. Sigrid felt her own wolf bristle beneath her skin. This was the place of her humiliation, the stones where she had been stripped of her title. She squeezed Torsten's hand. "Remember what I told you. Head up, shoulders back. Look them in the eye," Torsten recited perfectly. His small face was set in a mask of stoic determination. "I am not afraid." Good. They reached the massive iron gates. A dozen heavily armed guards stood watch, turning away commoners and minor merchants to keep the courtyard clear for the nobility. 2 guards crossed their spears as Sigrid approached, her boots caked in dried mud, her travel cloak stained with 3 days of the road. "Halt!" a young guard barked. "Keep moving, vagrant. The Alpha's keep is closed for the pup ceremony." Sigrid stopped. She slowly reached up and pulled her hood back. An older guard leaning against the stone wall suddenly choked on his breath. He pushed off the wall, his eyes going wide. "Luna," he whispered, the old title slipping out before he could stop it. "I am no one's Luna, Edric," Sigrid said calmly. She held out the crumpled, torn invitation. "But I was summoned." Edric stared at her. He had been there the day she was thrown out. He looked from her hardened face to the small boy holding her hand. Edric was a veteran wolf. His senses were sharp. As he looked at Torsten, his nostrils flared. The boy was small, wrapped in damp wool, but the scent rolling off him hit the old guard like a physical blow. It was the scent of a dominant, heavy, metallic, smelling of thunderstorms and ozone, the exact same scent that saturated the throne room. Edric's spear tip lowered automatically. His hands actually trembled. "Open the gates," he croaked to the younger guards. "But sir, she's—" "Open the damn gates!" Edric roared. The heavy iron doors groaned open. Sigrid didn't thank him. She simply walked through, pulling Torsten into the belly of the beast. The courtyard was a riot of colour and noise. Fire pits roared, roasting entire beasts on spits. Drunken laughter echoed off the walls. Pack members from every corner of the territory were dressed in their finest furs and leathers. Sigrid walked straight through the centre of it all. At first, she was just a dirty traveller in the crowd, but wolves are creatures of scent and instinct. One by one, heads turned. Conversation died. Laughter faded into a tense, suffocating silence. The sea of bodies naturally parted, stepping back as if burned by her presence. They recognized her, the Barren mate, the shame of the pack. But as they looked past her, their eyes locked onto the boy. Gasps ripped through the crowd. Men who had mocked her exile took a sudden step back, exposing their throats involuntarily to the sheer weight of the aura bleeding off the 5-year-old child. Sigrid reached the heavy oak doors of the great hall. 2 massive guards moved to block her, but before they could even speak, Torsten looked up at them. His ice-blue eyes narrowed. A low, barely audible growl rumbled in his small chest. The guards froze. Their wolves submitted before their human minds could process what was happening. They stepped aside. Sigrid pushed the doors open. The great hall was blindingly bright, lit by 100 iron chandeliers. At the far end, elevated on a dais of black stone, sat the thrones. Rorik lounged in his seat, wearing a crown of woven iron and wolf fangs. Beside him sat Livia, draped in white fox fur, looking radiant and smug. In Livia's arms rested a bundle of embroidered silk, the new, celebrated Heir. Nobles and alphas from neighbouring packs filled the room, raising goblets of mead, their voices bouncing off the vaulted ceiling in a deafening roar of celebration, until the doors slammed shut behind Sigrid. The sound was like a gunshot. The music abruptly stopped. The clatter of plates ceased. Hundreds of faces turned toward the entrance. Sigrid stood at the end of the long hall. She didn't cower. She didn't look down. She began to walk down the central aisle, the mud from her boots staining the pristine woven rugs. Rorik's laughter died in his throat. He sat up straight, his hands gripping the armrests of his throne, his eyes locked onto Sigrid. A cruel, triumphant smirk began to form on his lips. She had come. She had actually come to see his victory. He opened his mouth, ready to project his voice, ready to deliver the mocking welcome he had rehearsed for weeks. Then Rorik looked down. He saw the boy holding her hand. Rorik's smirk vanished. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him ashen. The goblet in his hand slipped from his fingers, hitting the stone floor with a sharp clang, spilling red wine that looked entirely too much like blood across the dais. The true heir had arrived. The wine dripped from the stone dais. Plop, plop, plop. It was the only sound in a room holding 300 wolves. The spilled vintage crept toward the edge of the stairs, staining the mortar like a fresh kill. Rorik did not breathe. His massive chest, clad in boiled leather and silver plates, remained perfectly still. His eyes were locked entirely on the boy holding Sigrid's hand. He saw the broad shoulders. He saw the square jaw. He saw the ice-blue eyes that mirrored his own so perfectly, it felt like looking through a tear in time. Sigrid stopped 10 paces from the throne. She didn't bow. She simply stood, the mud drying on her boots, and looked up at the man who had ordered her to die in the snow. "You invited me, Rorik," she said. Her voice was not loud, but in the dead silence, it carried to the rafters. "I apologize for the travel dirt. We walked." The casual nature of her words broke the spell. A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the gathered nobility. Visiting alphas shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between Rorik and the boy. The whispers began. A low, hissing tide of realization. Rorik finally found his voice. It was hoarse, stripped of its usual booming authority. "What is this, Sigrid? What game are you playing?" "No game," she replied, her face a mask of serene indifference. "You wish to celebrate the birth of an heir. I thought it only proper that the pack meet his older brother first." Livia jolted upright. The white fox fur slipped from her shoulders. She clutched the bundle of silk to her chest, her face twisting into a mask of ugly, naked panic. "Liar!" she shrieked. Her voice cracked, shrill and desperate, shattering the heavy dignity of the hall. "She's a liar, Rorik. You banished her because she was barren. That mutt is not yours." Torsten didn't flinch at the sudden noise. He simply turned his head and looked at Livia. It was not the look of a child. It was the heavy, assessing stare of an apex predator, determining if a sudden noise was a threat or just prey. The sheer weight of that stare made Livia choke on her next words. She pressed backward into her throne, pulling her screaming baby closer. The infant in Livia's arms, sensing its mother's terror, began to wail. It was a thin, reedy sound. The cry of a normal, fragile pup. "Silence her," a voice rumbled from the high tables. It was Lord Tybalt, a scarred, aging alpha from the northern ridges. He wasn't looking at Livia. He was staring intensely at Torsten. "The boy's scent is suffocating. I can taste the iron from here. That is no mutt." Rorik stepped down from the dais. He moved stiffly, as if his joints had turned to rust. He ignored Livia. He ignored Tybalt. He walked down the stone steps until he was standing on the floor level, towering over Sigrid. He was a massive man, built to intimidate. But Sigrid didn't so much as blink. She had survived winters that would have killed him. "Tell me the truth," Rorik growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural frequency meant to force submission. He pushed his alpha aura outward, a heavy, oppressive wave of dominance that made the lesser wolves in the front rows drop to their knees, clutching their throats. Sigrid felt the pressure against her skin. It felt like a warm breeze. 5 years ago, it would have forced her eyes to the floor. Now, her wolf was wild, forged in isolation, answering to absolutely no one. "I am telling you the truth," she said flatly. Rorik looked down at Torsten. The boy was staring straight back up at him. Rorik pushed his aura harder, directing it entirely at the child, intending to make him break eye contact. It was a brutal thing to do to a 5-year-old, a crude test of bloodlines. Torsten's nostrils flared. His small hands curled into fists at his sides. He did not look away. Instead, a low, rattling growl started in the boy's chest. It wasn't a warning. It was a challenge. A ripple of shock went through the visiting alphas. A pup resisting a fully mature Alpha King's command was unheard of. "He has your eyes, Rorik," Sigrid said quietly, stepping slightly between them, breaking the invisible tension. "He has your temper, and he has your blood. I was 2 months pregnant when you dragged me to the border and told me I was useless." Rorik flinched as if struck. The colour rushed back into his face in a furious, mottled red. "You hid him?" "My body hid him," Sigrid corrected, her tone sharp as shattered glass. "My wolf knew she was chained to a fool who cared more for appearances than patience. It shut down to keep him safe until I was out of your reach. You kept my son from me for 5 years, Rorik bellowed, the fury finally breaking through his shock. He reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could even brush her leather sleeve, Torsten moved. The boy stepped forward, placing himself directly between the Alpha King and his mother. He bared his teeth, small, white, and sharp. The sheer intensity of the protective instincts radiating from the child forced Rorik to freeze. "Do not touch her," Torsten said. His voice was small, childish, but the command laced within it was undeniable. The great hall was paralyzed. Rorik, the fearsome Alpha King, stood with his hand suspended in the air, held back by a boy who barely reached his hip. The truth was no longer a question of words. It was written in the air, in the scent of iron and ozone, and in the undeniable power of the firstborn. "This is treason," Livia's voice sliced through the heavy air again, trembling with an edge of hysteria. She handed the wailing infant to a terrified handmaiden and stood up, her silken gown catching on the rough stone of the dais. "She brings a bastard from the borderlands, coaches him to snarl, and you all stand there staring? Throw her in the dungeon, kill the whelp." A collective murmur of disgust rolled through the room. Even Rorik's own guards looked uncomfortable. To threaten a pup, any pup, was a gross violation of pack law. To threaten one that smelled so distinctly of the king was madness. "Livia, sit down," Rorik snapped, not taking his eyes off Torsten. "I will not," she screamed, descending the first 2 steps. "He is my mate. You are looking at a beggar, Rorik. You are looking at a woman who slept in the mud with vagrants." "Quiet!" The word boomed from the back of the hall, carrying the raspy weight of immense age. The crowd parted instantly. Elder Garrick walked forward. He was ancient, his face a road map of scars and deep wrinkles, leaning heavily on a staff of twisted ash. He was the keep's seer, the oldest living wolf in the territory, and the only man Rorik truly feared. Garrick didn't look at Rorik, nor at Livia. He walked straight to Sigrid. "Sigrid of the Northern Ridge," Garrick said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Elder Garrick," Sigrid replied, dipping her head in a slight, respectful nod. He was the only one in this cursed keep who had looked at her with pity on the day she was banished. Garrick turned his milky blind eyes toward Torsten. He reached out a trembling, gnarled hand. Torsten looked up at Sigrid. She gave him a single, reassuring nod. The boy stepped forward and let the old man place a hand on his head. Garrick closed his eyes. The hall held its breath. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the hearth fires and the distant, muffled cries of Livia's infant. Garrick inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of the boy, feeling the pulse of the wolf resting beneath the young skin. When he opened his eyes, a single tear tracked down his weathered cheek, catching in his grey beard. He removed his hand and leaned heavily on his staff. He turned to face the room. "There is no deception here," Garrick announced, his voice carrying an absolute, crushing finality. "The boy is forged of the Iron Keep. He is the blood of Rorik's grandfather, and his grandfather before him. He is the firstborn, the true heir." Chaos erupted. Lords shouted over one another. Goblets were slammed onto tables. Livia let out a wail of despair, collapsing onto the stairs of the dais, weeping openly. Her absolute claim to power had just evaporated in front of the entire kingdom. Rorik looked physically ill. He stared at his hands, then at Sigrid. The reality of what he had done was settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He had banished his true mate. He had thrown his firstborn son into the freezing wild. He had traded a wolf forged of pure iron for a woman who sat weeping on the stairs because her status was threatened. "Sigrid," Rorik whispered, taking a slow step forward. The anger was gone. In its place was a desperate, clawing panic. "I didn't know. The healers said your womb was dead. I had to secure the line." "You secured nothing," Sigrid said coldly. "You panicked like a frightened dog." Rorik swallowed hard, looking down at Torsten. "Here's my son. He is beautiful, Sigrid. You must stay. We can fix this. I will annul the mating with Livia. She will be compensated. You will take your rightful place as Luna. We will raise him here, where he belongs." Livia shrieked in horror, but Rorik didn't even glance back at her. His eyes were entirely on the prize he had lost, the strong, perfect son. Sigrid looked at the Alpha King. She looked at the expensive tapestries, the roasted meats, the gold bands on Rorik's arms. She felt absolutely nothing but a hollow, lingering disgust. "You misunderstand why I am here, Rorik," she said smoothly. Rorik frowned, confusion pulling at his features. "You brought him back to claim his birthright, to show me my heir." "I brought him to claim his birthright," Sigrid corrected, her voice raising just enough to cut through the din of the hall. "I did not bring him back to you." The whispers died instantly. The silence returned, thicker and more dangerous than before. "He is 5 years old," Sigrid continued, her eyes sweeping over the gathered alphas, addressing them as much as she addressed Rorik. "By ancient pack law, a firstborn cannot be denied his claim to the territory unless he is defeated in a rite of combat at maturity. I am not here to move back into your bed, Rorik. I am here to formally register his existence before the Council of Elders, so that when he comes of age, he can take this keep from you." Rorik's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. You would leave with him? He is the king's son. He belongs in the keep." "He belongs with his mother," Sigrid fired back, her composure slipping just enough to let the raw, feral mother wolf bare its teeth. "He belongs in the woods, where he learns how to hunt, how to survive, and how to spot a weak leader. He will not be raised by a man who discards his family the moment they become inconvenient." She reached down and took Torsten's hand again. The boy gripped her fingers tightly, his small face a mask of absolute loyalty. "Elder Garrick," Sigrid called out, ignoring the king entirely. "You have witnessed him. The pack has smelled him. Is his claim legally recognized?" Garrick nodded slowly, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is recorded, Sigrid. The blood is known." "Then we are finished here," she said. She turned her back on the Alpha King. She didn't look at Livia. She didn't look at the stunned lords. She simply walked back down the long aisle of the great hall, her muddy boots leaving a definitive trail over the fine carpets, leading her true alpha right back out the door. The heavy oak doors boomed shut. The sound was a physical blow, rattling the iron hinges and vibrating through the floorboards. For 10 seconds, the great hall of the Iron Keep was a tomb. The gathered lords and alphas stared at the closed doors, processing the seismic shift that had just fractured their political landscape. Then, the room exploded. Voices crashed over one another in a tidal wave of panic and opportunism. Minor lords whispered frantically to their advisors. Visiting alphas calculated the sudden vulnerability of Rorik's borders. A king who could not control his own mate, who did not even know the existence of his firstborn, was a king bleeding in open water. Rorik stood, paralyzed at the base of the dais. His chest heaved. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his leather collar. He had built his entire rule on the image of unyielding strength. In 10 minutes, a woman in mud-stained boots and a 5-year-old boy had stripped him naked before his rivals. "Rorik!" Livia sobbed, scrambling down the stone steps. She grabbed his arm, her manicured nails digging into his flesh. "You cannot let them leave. That boy will be a banner for every traitor in the pack. They will rally behind him. They will murder our son." Rorik struck her. It was a backhand, born of pure, reflexive humiliation. Livia hit the stone floor with a sharp cry, her lips splitting. The handmaidens gasped, shrinking into the shadows. Rorik didn't even look down at her. He rubbed his knuckles, his eyes fixed on the heavy doors. "Gareth!" Rorik barked. A man detached himself from the shadows near the far wall. He was tall, lean, and covered in dull chainmail that didn't clink when he moved. Gareth was the captain of the King's Guard, a wolf who dealt in quiet disappearances and midnight executions. He smelled of old copper and wet dog. "My king," Gareth said, bowing his head, "take 6 of your best men. The silent ones," Rorik ordered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, deadly rasp. "Follow them. The mud will slow them down. Do not engage them on the main road. Wait until they cross into the deep pines, where there are no witnesses." Gareth's eyes flicked toward the doors. "And the orders, sire?" Rorik's jaw tightened. He thought of the boy. The perfect, arrogant, beautiful boy who possessed the sheer dominance he had prayed for. The boy who had snarled at him. "Bring me the boy," Rorik said. The words tasted like ash. "Unharmed. You put a single scratch on him, and I will flay you alive. He is the heir of the Iron Keep." Gareth nodded slowly. "And the mother?" Rorik finally looked down at Livia, who was weeping quietly on the stones, clutching her bruised face. He thought of Sigrid's eyes, the utter lack of fear, the absolute, freezing contempt. She would never bend. She would never hand the boy over peacefully. "The mother is a vagrant who stole royal blood," Rorik said coldly. "Leave her in the woods." Gareth bowed again and slipped out a side door, melting into the corridors of the keep like a ghost. Miles away, the rain began to fall again. It started as a fine, freezing mist, clinging to the heavy wool of Sigrid's cloak. She walked quickly. Her stride was long and purposeful, eating up the distance on the muddy logging road. She held Torsten's hand tightly, half pulling him along. The adrenaline that had armored her in the great hall was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, sharp survival instinct. "Mama, you are hurting my fingers," Torsten murmured, trying to keep up with her relentless pace. Sigrid instantly loosened her grip. "I am sorry, little wolf. We need to make distance. The king's pride is a fragile thing. He will not let us walk away." Torsten looked back over his shoulder, toward the distant, dark spires of the keep. "Will he send men to fight us?" "He will send men to take you," Sigrid corrected. She stopped and crouched down, forcing Torsten to look her in the eye. Rain dripped from her eyelashes. "Listen to me. We are not going back the way we came. We are going off the road. The mud here leaves tracks a blind man could follow. We head into the ravine of echoes." It was a treacherous stretch of territory. Steep, rocky inclines covered in slick moss, dense patches of thorny underbrush, and a narrow river that ran fast and deadly cold. It was no place for a child. It was barely a place for a grown wolf. "Okay," Torsten said simply. There was no fear in his voice, just absolute trust. They veered off the road. Sigrid moved with practiced efficiency. She taught Torsten where to step, on exposed roots, on solid rock, avoiding the soft earth that would capture their prints. She gathered pine needles and dusted them over the few tracks they inevitably left. It wouldn't fool a master tracker forever, but it would buy them time. The rain was their ally now, washing away their scent, blending the iron and ozone of Torsten's bloodline into the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. By midnight, they reached the mouth of the ravine. The darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating beneath the canopy of ancient pines. The sound of the rushing river below masked the noise of their breathing. Sigrid stopped. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Beneath the scent of rain and pine, she caught it. A faint, metallic tang. Sweat. Leather. Wet fur. They were being hunted. And the hounds were fast. "Torsten," Sigrid whispered, her voice barely a breath against the rushing water. "Climb the oak, the one with the hollow. Go high. Do not make a sound, no matter what you hear down here. Understand?" Torsten's small brow furrowed. His protective instincts surged, a low rumble starting in his throat. "No," Sigrid said sharply, grabbing his shoulders. "You are an alpha. But right now, you are a pup. A king knows when to fight and when to hold his ground. Your ground is in that tree. Go." Torsten hesitated, then turned and scrambled up the rough bark of the massive oak, his small fingers finding holds with unnatural strength. He vanished into the dark foliage. Sigrid drew her rusted iron dagger. It was an ugly, heavy thing, meant for gutting deer, not fighting elite guards. She slid into the shadows of a jagged rock formation, letting the darkness swallow her completely. She was no longer the humiliated mate. She was the mother of the woods, and the woods were hungry. 6 shadows moved through the trees. They were completely silent, communicating only through sharp, precise hand signals. Gareth led the pack, his eyes scanning the treacherous, slick rocks of the ravine. The rain was working against them. The boy's heavy alpha scent, so prominent in the keep, was muted here, washed out by the freezing downpour. But Gareth was a veteran. He read the crushed moss, the snapped twig, the slight disturbance in the pine needles. He halted, holding up a clenched fist. The 5 men behind him froze instantly. Gareth knelt by a flat stone. There was a smear of mud on the edge. Fresh. He touched it, bringing his fingers to his nose. It smelled of cheap leather and borderland dirt. He pointed down into the narrowest part of the ravine, where the rock walls closed in tightly on either side, creating a natural bottleneck before the river crossing. He motioned for 2 men to flank the ridge above, while he and the remaining 3 took the low ground. They moved in. The darkness was absolute. The roar of the river swallowed the sound of their boots. Gareth stepped into the bottleneck. His senses screamed at him a fraction of a second before the trap sprang. There was no battle cry, no dramatic monologue, only the vicious, wet sound of a heavy branch snapping back into place. Sigrid had rigged a thick pine sapling, bent backward under immense tension, held by a simple vine trigger. As the guard to Gareth's left stepped forward, his boot snapped the vine. The sapling whipped through the air with the force of a swinging mast. It struck the guard square in the chest. Ribs cracked like dry kindling. The man was launched backward off the slick rocks, plunging into the freezing, violent river below with a heavy splash. He didn't resurface. "Ambush!" Gareth roared, the command finally breaking the silence. "Above us!" The guards shifted, drawing long, curved hunting blades. They looked up toward the ridges, expecting a coordinated attack. They expected borderland rogues. They expected numbers. They didn't look down. Sigrid launched herself from the shadow of the rocks directly at their feet. She didn't shift into her wolf form. The narrow terrain was too tight for a massive beast, and a human body offered more leverage in the mud. She drove her rusted dagger upward, burying it deep into the thigh of the closest guard. The man shrieked, collapsing heavily. Sigrid didn't wait to pull the blade out. She let go of the handle, grabbed the falling man's wrist, and twisted brutally. The bone snapped. She ripped his hunting blade from his grip and rolled out of the way, just as Gareth's sword cleaved the air where her head had been a second before. She came to her feet in a crouch, her breath pluming in the cold air. Blood stained her hands. Her eyes were completely black, the wolf beneath her skin pushing dangerously close to the surface. "Stand down, Sigrid," Gareth breathed, circling her carefully. He signaled his remaining 2 men to fan out. "The king only wants the boy. You don't have to die here." "The king is a coward who sends dogs to steal children," Sigrid spat. One of the guards lunged from her blind spot. Sigrid dropped low, sliding on the wet mud, and slashed outward with her stolen blade. It caught the back of the guard's knee, severing the tendon completely. He went down, screaming. 3 down, 3 left, but Gareth was fast. As Sigrid recovered her balance, he kicked out, catching her squarely in the ribs. The breath exploded from her lungs in a sharp gasp. She tumbled backward, slamming hard against the sheer rock face of the ravine. Pain flared white-hot in her side. Gareth advanced, his blade lowered. "Where is the pup?" "Go to hell," she wheezed. Gareth raised his sword. "Find the boy," he ordered his remaining men. "I'll finish this." He brought the sword down. A heavy pine cone struck Gareth perfectly in the center of his forehead. It didn't do damage, but it broke his concentration, causing his strike to graze the rock next to Sigrid's ear, showering her in sparks. Gareth cursed, taking a step back and looking up. High above them, standing on a thick branch of the hollow oak, was Torsten. The boy wasn't hiding anymore. He was staring down at the men attacking his mother. And he was furious. The air in the ravine suddenly grew heavy. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The river's roar was drowned out by a sound that made Gareth's blood run entirely cold. It was a howl, but it wasn't the howl of a 5-year-old child. It was a deep, resonant, chest-rattling sound that belonged to an ancient, massive beast. The sheer dominance packed into the vibration forced the 2 standing guards to drop to their knees, clutching their ears, their wolves whimpering in absolute submission. Even Gareth stumbled, his vision blurring as the heavy alpha aura pressed down on him like a physical weight. The boy was projecting raw, unrefined power, fueled by a primal need to protect his pack. Sigrid didn't waste the distraction. She pushed off the rock wall, ignoring the agony in her ribs. She tackled Gareth, using her momentum to drive him into the mud. She pinned his sword arm with her knee and pressed the edge of her blade directly against his throat. Gareth froze. He looked up into Sigrid's wild, merciless eyes. The boy's terrifying howl echoed into silence, leaving only the rushing water and the heavy breathing of the combatants. Sigrid pressed the blade just hard enough to draw a thin bead of blood. "You are going to walk back to the Iron Keep," Sigrid whispered, her voice colder than the rain. "You are going to walk into the Great Hall, and you are going to stand before Rorik." Gareth swallowed hard, the sharp edge scraping his Adam's apple. "Tell him the Borderlands claim his blood now," Sigrid continued, her eyes boring into his soul. "Tell him he no longer has a son. And tell him if he ever sends his dogs after us again." She leaned in closer, the scent of fresh blood and wet earth filling the space between them. "I will send back their pelts." She abruptly stood up, taking his sword and throwing it into the roaring river below. She whistled a sharp, single note. A moment later, Torsten scrambled down the trunk of the oak, dropping lightly to the ground. He walked over to his mother, glaring at the defeated guards in the mud. Sigrid took his hand. They turned their backs on the bleeding king's guard and disappeared into the unforgiving darkness of the deep woods. The borderlands did not care about royal blood. The harsh, jagged peaks of the Northern Territory demanded only one thing: survival. A massive stag tore through the deep snow, its breath plumed in frantic, ragged bursts. Behind it, running with a terrifying, silent efficiency, was a 14-year-old boy. Torsten did not wear furs. He wore a simple leather tunic, his bare arms exposed to the biting frost. Sweat slicked his skin, freezing almost instantly in the crisp air, but he didn't shiver. His body ran like a furnace. He moved over the treacherous, root-choked terrain with the grace of a shadow, his ice-blue eyes locked entirely on the stag's hindquarters. He didn't carry a bow. He carried a heavy ash spear, tipped with a crude iron head he had forged himself. The stag hit a snowdrift and stumbled. It was a fraction of a second, a tiny miscalculation in the frantic scramble for life. It was all Torsten needed. He planted his boot against a frozen pine trunk, using the momentum to launch himself forward. He drove the spear downward in a clean, brutal arc. The iron tip severed the stag's spine instantly. The beast collapsed without a sound, sliding through the red-stained snow before coming to a halt. Torsten stood over the kill. He didn't cheer. He simply placed a hand on the stag's flank, a silent, instinctual gesture of respect, and pulled the spear free. 100 yards away, standing on a rocky outcrop, Sigrid watched. She leaned against a crag of black stone, her face weathered by 9 years of borderland winters. The softness of the keep had long been burned away, leaving only sharp angles and hardened muscle. Beside her stood Gideon, a scarred, one-eyed rogue who led the loosely gathered exiles of the Pale Peaks. "He took it on the run," Gideon grunted, crossing his massive arms. "I've seen grown men, veteran hunters, miss that strike and break their ankles. He didn't even shift into his wolf. He doesn't need to shift to hunt," Sigrid said quietly. "He's getting too big, Sigrid," Gideon warned, though there was a deep undercurrent of respect in his raspy voice. "The men in the camp, they defer to him, not to me. Yesterday, 2 trappers were ready to gut each other over a stolen pelt. Torsten just looked at them, didn't say a word. The men dropped their knives and backed away, exposing their throats. He's 14. It's unnatural." "It is exactly what is natural," Sigrid corrected. She watched her son hoist the massive stag onto his shoulders, bearing a weight that would have buckled a pack horse. "He is the true firstborn. The wild knows it. The exiles know it. He isn't a rogue, Gideon. He's a king without a stone chair." Miles away, the stone chair was rotting. The great hall of the Iron Keep was suffocatingly warm, filled with the stifling scent of heavy perfumes and roasted meats left out too long. The iron chandeliers, once blindingly bright, were dim. Half the candles had burned out, and the servants were too apathetic to replace them. Rorik sat on his throne. He was only 40, but he looked a decade older. The silver plates of his armor hung loosely on his frame. The unyielding strength that had once defined his rule had calcified into a bitter, paranoid rigidity. Beside him, Livia picked at a plate of sweet grapes. The white fox fur draped over her shoulders looked slightly yellowed, its edges fraying. She had grown sharp and anxious, her eyes constantly darting toward the heavy oak doors, as if expecting a ghost to walk through them. At the base of the dais sat Cassian. The official heir to the Iron Keep was 9 years old. He was a pale, soft child, wrapped in expensive silks that swallowed his slight frame. He was complaining loudly to a handmaiden about the draught creeping through the stone walls, his voice carrying a thin, reedy whine that set Rorik's teeth on edge. Rorik stared at the boy, his son, the pup he had traded his true mate for. Cassian possessed no alpha aura. There was no scent of ozone, no crushing weight of dominance. He smelled of milk and nervous sweat. When the visiting lords looked at him, they didn't bare their throats. They smiled pitying smiles and exchanged calculating glances. Lord Tybalt, the aging alpha of the northern ridges, had already stopped paying his border tithes. 2 other minor lords had quietly withdrawn their guards from Rorik's eastern garrison. The pack smelled the weakness. They were circling. "Make him stop whining," Rorik rasped, rubbing his temples. Livia bristled. "He is cold, Rorik. The servants are useless. Cassian, darling, come sit by the hearth." Cassian scrambled up, shooting a fearful glance at his father before rushing to the fire. Rorik closed his eyes. Every time he looked at Cassian, he saw the ravine of echoes. He saw Gareth, his captain of the guard, returning 9 years ago, covered in mud and blood, missing 3 men, carrying a message that had haunted Rorik's nightmares ever since. The borderlands claim his blood now. Rorik gripped the arms of his throne until his knuckles turned white. He had sent trackers into the deep woods 12 times over the years. None of them ever found a trace of Sigrid or the boy. Most of them never returned at all. The borderlands had swallowed them whole, forging the firstborn in isolation, entirely out of Rorik's control. A heavy, suffocating dread settled in Rorik's chest. The pack law was absolute. The title of Alpha King was not passed through silk and sweet grapes. It was held by strength. He looked at Cassian, warming his hands by the fire, jumping at the sound of a hound barking in the courtyard. Rorik knew it, deep in his marrow. The Iron Keep was bleeding to death, and somewhere in the ice and snow, the wolf who would tear its throat out was growing larger every day. The wind howled off the jagged cliffs, carrying the bitter promise of a deep freeze. It was Torsten's 18th winter. He stood at the edge of the tree line, looking down into the sprawling valley that belonged to the Iron Keep. He was no longer a boy. Torsten had grown into a leviathan of a man. He stood 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a heavy cloak of black wolf fur. His jaw was square and covered in thick, dark stubble. But his eyes remained the same, piercing, unyielding glacier ice that missed absolutely nothing. The aura radiating from him was no longer a child's raw, uncontrolled burst. It was a suffocating, constant pressure. It smelled of thunderheads and freshly spilled blood. When he walked through the exile camp, men instinctively pressed their backs against the walls, unable to stand fully upright in his presence. Footsteps crunched in the snow behind him. Sigrid stepped up to his side. Her hair was heavily streaked with silver now, but she stood as straight as a spear. She carried a bundle wrapped in oiled leather. "A runner arrived from the eastern valley this morning," Sigrid said, her breath misting. "A defector from Rorik's own guard. He rode 3 days through the blizzard to find our camp." Torsten didn't turn his head. He kept his eyes on the distant horizon, where the faint smudge of smoke from the Iron Keep stained the grey sky. "And? The blood moon rises in 3 days," Sigrid replied. "Rorik is forcing the transition. He intends to officially pass the Alpha title to Cassian under the full moon to cement his claim before Lord Tybalt or the other Alphas can mount a formal challenge." Torsten's jaw tightened. "Cassian is weak. The Keep soldiers whisper that he can barely lift a broadsword. If he takes the Alpha bite, the pack will fracture. The neighboring territories will invade within the month. Hundreds will die." "Yes," Sigrid agreed softly. Torsten finally turned to look at his mother. The silent communication between them was absolute. For 13 years they had lived in the dirt. They had starved, they had bled, and they had survived. They had built a life out of ash and frost, but they both knew this day was inevitable. A true Alpha cannot ignore a rotting pack. The instinct to lead, to protect, to conquer was carved into his DNA. Sigrid held out the oiled leather bundle. Torsten took it. He unwrapped the leather to reveal a rusted, heavy iron dagger. It was the same blade Sigrid had used to gut the king's guard in the ravine of echoes. "I am not asking you to take the keep for me," Sigrid said, her voice fiercely steady. "I have no desire to sleep in those stone halls ever again. I am asking you to take it because it is yours. Because those people, weak and misguided as they are, belong to you. Go cut the rot out, Torsten." Torsten gripped the hilt of the dagger. He didn't smile. He didn't give a speech. He simply turned back toward the valley and began to walk. He did not walk alone. As he descended the mountain pass, shadows detached themselves from the trees. Gideon fell into step 10 paces behind him. Then came a dozen hardened rogues. Then 30 more. By the time Torsten reached the main logging road, a silent, terrifying army of 300 borderland wolves marched at his back. There were no banners. There were no war horns, just the crushing, rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen mud and the overwhelming scent of wild, unchained predators. They marched for 2 days. They did not stop to sleep. The heat radiating from Torsten's pure alpha blood fueled them, driving the pack forward through the biting cold. On the evening of the 3rd day, the massive iron gates of the keep loomed through the freezing fog. The heavy oak doors of the great hall were thrown wide open. The blood moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting a sickly red glow over the courtyard. Inside the hall, Rorik stood on the dais. He held a ceremonial blade, ready to make the blood pact with Cassian, who knelt trembling before him. The room was packed with nervous lords and anxious guards. The tension was suffocating. Livia stood to the side, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were bone-white. "By the blood of the ancients," Rorik boomed, though his voice lacked its former resonance. "I pass the strength of the iron to my son." A massive, echoing crack shattered the ritual. The heavy wooden doors of the great hall didn't just open. They were violently thrown back against the stone walls, the iron hinges shrieking in protest. The entire hall spun around. Guards drew their swords. Lords reached for their daggers. But as the freezing fog rolled into the warm hall, the weapons began to lower. The soldiers of the Iron Keep felt it before they saw it. A wave of pure, undeniable dominance hit them like a physical wall. It forced the breath from their lungs. Several guards in the back rows simply dropped to their knees, unable to remain standing. Torsten walked through the doors. He was coated in a thin layer of frost, his black fur cloak billowing slightly behind him. He looked like a god of war stepping out of a frozen myth. He walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the hundreds of wide, terrified eyes. His gaze was locked entirely on the aging king. Rorik froze. The ceremonial knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the stone steps. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He recognized the eyes. He recognized the jaw. But the sheer, monstrous size of the man before him defied belief. Livia let out a muffled shriek, stumbling backward and dragging Cassian with her. Cassian hid his face in her skirts, whimpering. Torsten stopped 10 paces from the throne. He stood in the exact same spot his mother had stood 13 years ago. The great hall was locked in a dead, suffocating silence. Even the crackle of the hearth seemed to quiet. Torsten reached into his belt, drew the rusted iron dagger, and threw it. It spun end over end, burying itself deep into the heavy wood of Rorik's throne, missing the king's thigh by an inch. "Rorik of the Iron Keep." Torsten's voice resonated through the hall, a deep, earth-shaking rumble that vibrated in the chests of every wolf present. "Your rule is hollow. Your heir is false. I am the firstborn of your blood, forged in the exile you commanded. Torsten rolled his massive shoulders, his eyes burning with blue fire. "I invoke the right of the blood moon. Step down from that chair, old man, or I will bury you beneath it." The rusted metal of the dagger hummed. The vibration traveled through the ancient wood of the throne, a low, buzzing testament to the challenge. Livia broke first. "Kill him!" she shrieked, her voice tearing her throat. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Torsten. "He is a rogue. He is a bastard of the mud. Guards, cut him down." Nobody moved. The keep's soldiers remained utterly frozen. Some had dropped their swords, others kept their heads bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the towering man in the center aisle. The alpha aura bleeding from Torsten was absolute. It wrapped around the throats of every wolf in the room, demanding total compliance. "Pack law," an old, gravelly voice echoed. Lord Tybalt stepped out from the crowded sidelines. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his face deeply lined with age, but his eyes were bright with vicious anticipation. "The Blood Moon Challenge has been issued by a recognized bloodline. No man interferes. The gods of iron and earth will decide who holds the seat." Rorik stared at the man who was his son. He felt the heavy, suffocating silence of 300 wolves waiting to see if their king was a coward. There was no escape. To refuse the challenge was to forfeit the throne and his life. Slowly, with stiff, agonizing reluctance, Rorik unbuckled his silver chest plate. It hit the stone floor with a heavy clang. He stripped away his white fur mantle, leaving only his linen tunic and leather breeches. He was a massive man, thickly muscled from years of drills, but the grey in his beard and the heavy bags under his eyes betrayed the rot within. "You think you know what it takes to rule?" Rorik spat, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of terror and rage. "You know nothing but the dirt, boy." "The dirt is honest," Torsten replied softly. He unclasped his black wolf pelt and let it fall to the floor. Beneath it, Torsten wore no armor. His torso was a map of brutal survival. White, jagged scars from bare claws, burn marks from forge fires, and the thick, corded muscle of a life spent fighting for every single breath. Rorik didn't wait. He let out a deafening roar, his bones cracking violently as he forced the shift. In seconds, a massive, grey-furred wolf stood in his place. The beast lunged, its jaws snapping fiercely toward Torsten's exposed throat. Torsten did not shift. He planted his boots on the woven carpet, dropping his center of gravity. As the grey wolf's jaws closed in, Torsten simply brought his forearm up, taking the bite directly against his leather bracer. The iron teeth sank through the thick hide and into his flesh. Blood instantly bloomed, hot and dark. Torsten didn't even grit his teeth. He grabbed the thick fur around Rorik's neck with his free hand, anchored his feet into the stone floor, and twisted his entire body. With a sickening crunch, he slammed the massive grey wolf into the ground. The great hall shuddered. Rorik scrambled, his claws sparking violently against the stone as he tried to regain his footing. He was heavy, fueled by the desperate panic of a dying rain. He snapped again, catching Torsten's side, tearing through his tunic and drawing a fresh line of red across his ribs. Torsten stepped back. The blood trickled down his torso. He looked at his father. There was no hatred in his ice-blue eyes. Only the cold, calculating detachment of a hunter watching wounded prey exhaust itself. "My turn," Torsten whispered. The shift was instantaneous. There was no screaming, no frantic cracking of bones. One moment Torsten stood there, and the next, a black titan occupied the space. The wolf was monstrous, easily a foot taller at the shoulder than Rorik. Its fur was pitch black, absorbing the dim light of the hall, and its eyes burned like blue stars in the shadows. Rorik charged. It was his final mistake. The black wolf met him head-on. Torsten didn't bite. He used his sheer mass. He slammed his shoulder directly into Rorik's chest. The sound of ribs fracturing echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a snapping branch in a silent forest. Rorik was thrown backward, crashing heavily into the base of the dais. Before the old king could even attempt to rise, Torsten was on him. The black wolf pinned Rorik's throat beneath one massive, heavy paw. He leaned down, exposing his long, curved fangs, until his jaws were mere inches from Rorik's face. The growl that ripped from Torsten's chest shook the dust from the high rafters. It was a demand for total, unconditional surrender. Rorik's grey wolf whined. The fight was completely gone. He pressed his belly into the cold stone, exposing his neck entirely, flattening his ears. The king of the Iron Keep submitted to the wild. Torsten held him there for 10 agonizing seconds, letting the entire pack witness the absolute breaking of their ruler. Then, the black wolf stepped back. Torsten shifted back to his human form, ignoring the blood dripping from his arm. He walked past the trembling grey wolf. He walked past Livia, who had collapsed onto the stairs, weeping hysterically while clutching a terrified Cassian. He stepped up onto the dais. He gripped the hilt of the rusted dagger embedded in the throne and wrenched it free. The wood splintered. Torsten turned to face the great hall. He sat down heavily in the high seat. He didn't ask for their loyalty. He didn't speak a single word. He simply rested his bleeding arm on the armrest and looked out at them, as 300 wolves dropped to their knees. Lord Tybalt bowed his head so low it brushed the stone. The exiles who had followed Torsten filed into the back of the hall, their eyes hard and watchful, taking their rightful places as the new royal guard. The rot was cut out. The wild had finally come home. Torsten didn't just break Rorik's crown. He shattered the entire foundation of the Iron Keep, proving that true power is forged in the wild, not inherited in a soft castle. What did you think of Torsten's brutal, silent takeover? Did Rorik and Livia get exactly what they deserved? Or was the justice of the borderlands too harsh for the aging king? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. If this gritty, intense werewolf drama kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share the story with your pack, and subscribe to the channel for more epic tales.